For decades, when we talk about Israel's biggest strategic threat in the Middle East, the answer was always straightforward: Iran. Iran's nuclear program, Hezbollah, Syria, the Houthis, the axis of resistance. But something potentially much bigger is beginning to emerge from the wreckage of region's recent wars. Because as Iranian influence across the Levant has weakened, another regional power has been moving into some of the space that Iran once occupied. And that power is Turkey. This doesn't mean Turkey is becoming another Iran. It also doesn't mean Israel and Turkey are about to go to war. Far from it. But their strategic interests are increasingly colliding. And nowhere is that collision clearer than in Syria. So, the question I want to explore today is this. After spending years trying to contain Iran, is Israel inadvertently creating its next great regional rival in Turkey? And could Syria become the arena in which that rivalry takes shape? So welcome to the strange new Middle East. To understand what's happening, we need to look at how dramatically the regional balance has changed. For years, Syria was one of the central pillars of Iranian power. Iran had military assets there. The IRGC, Hezbollah used Syria as a logistical corridor to send weapons, personnel, and money from Iran to Lebanon. From Israel's perspective, this was an enormous strategic threat, and Tel Aviv spent years conducting what became known as the campaign between the wars. Hundreds of strikes designed to prevent Iran from establishing a permanent military infrastructure in Syria. But that regional landscape has changed now. Assad is gone. Iranian influence has been significantly weakened. Hezbollah has been degraded. And the traditional Iranian land corridor through Syria has been disrupted. Now on paper, that should represent an extraordinary strategic victory for Israel. Except in the world of geopolitics, such vacuums are rarely left empty. And one of the countries best positioned to exploit this new landscape is Turkey. So enter Turkey. Now, following Ahmed al-Shaara's victory in Syria in late 2024, Turkey suddenly found itself with something Ankara had wanted for years: the possibility of a friendly government in Damascus. Turkey already possesses enormous influence in northern Syria. It has military forces inside the country. It has relationships with Syrian political and armed groups. It has substantial economic interests. And unlike Israel, Turkey's preferred end state appears to be a relatively unified Syrian state, one in which Ankara enjoys considerable political, economic, and military influence. For President Erdogan, this fits comfortably into Turkey's broader strategy. Some describe this as neo-Ottomanism. I think that term sometimes exaggerates what Turkey is actually doing. Turkey's strategy is generally more pragmatic than ideology. It doesn't want to be the new Ottomans. It wants strategic depth. It wants influence over its neighborhood. It wants to prevent Kurdish separatism. And it wants Turkey to be recognized as one of the major powers shaping the Middle East. But here's the problem. Israel appears to want something quite different in Syria. So this is the two visions of Syria. While Turkey wants stability, Israel's ideal Syria is almost the opposite of Turkey. Stability under a government it can influence. That is what Ankara wants. But Israel appears far more comfortable with a Syria that remains militarily weak, decentralized, and incapable of threatening Israel. And there's a very understandable reason for that. For Israel, Syria is not just a neighbor. It is strategic geography. It sits behind the Golan Heights. Its airspace provides access towards Iran and Iraq, and historically has provided the corridor through which Iranian weapons reached Hezbollah. Israel therefore has very little incentive to allow another powerful regional military to replace Iran. Which brings us to the latest developments. Early this week, Turkey had been moving surveillance equipment and potentially more advanced military capabilities into Syria. Israel subsequently attacked the Abu al-Daher airbase with airstrikes. And according to some analysis, at least part of Israel's concern was the possibility of Turkish military infrastructure becoming entrenched there. This doesn't mean Israel was attacking Turkey. It also doesn't mean that Israel was establishing a permanent antagonistic state against Turkey. Far from it. But it does suggest that Israel was establishing a red line. Iranian military infrastructure was not acceptable in Syria. So Turkish military infrastructure is also not acceptable. And that is where this gets interesting, because Turkey is not Iran. Turkey is different. It is a NATO member. It possesses one of the largest militaries in the alliance. It has a sophisticated defense industry. It controls strategically important geography, connecting Europe, the Black Sea, the Caucasus, and the Middle East. And perhaps most important, Turkey is not diplomatically isolated. So for decades, when we talked about Israel's biggest strategic threat and Israel attacking Iran, people normally kept quiet. And Israel could conduct repeated military operations against Iranian infrastructure in Syria without creating crisis inside NATO. But doing the same thing against Turkish assets would be completely different. And this is why I don't think we're heading towards an Israel-Turkey war, at least not deliberately. Both countries understand how catastrophic that would be. Washington would exert enormous pressure on both governments to prevent it. The US already has enough problems managing Iran, the Gulf, and the Hormuz. The last thing the US wants is two major American partners entering a military confrontation with one another. So the most likely scenario is not war. It's something much more ambiguous, a geopolitical contest in which both sides continually test each other's red lines. So Syria becomes that chessboard. Now think of Syria as the board on which this competition is being played. Turkey wants influence over Damascus. Israel wants freedom of military action. Turkey wants a unified Syrian state. Israel has reasons to prefer a weaker and more decentralized Syria. Turkey wants to prevent Kurdish autonomy from being entrenched. Israel has historically viewed non-Arab minorities, especially the Kurds, as potentially useful strategic partners. Now, these are not small disagreements. They're fundamentally different visions of the future regional order. But there's an important distinction. Strategic competition does not automatically mean military confrontation. There's still enormous space between those two outcomes. So it brings us to perhaps the most sensitive issue of all, the Kurdish question. It's tempting to imagine that Israel could respond to Turkish expansion by strengthening Kurdish groups inside Syria. From a purely geopolitical perspective, the logic is obvious. If Turkey is becoming a strategic competitor, supporting actors that constrain Turkish power creates leverage. Israel has also historically maintained relationships with the Kurds elsewhere in the region. But there are some serious limits to the strategy. First, Syrian Kurds and their politics are different from Iranian Kurdish politics, and so are the Iraqi Kurdish politics. You cannot simply be treating everybody, all the Kurds, as one geopolitical bloc. Second, Israel doesn't have an easy logistical route through which it can provide large-scale support to Syrian Kurdish forces. And third, and the most important, the US would be extremely uncomfortable with Israel deliberately using the Kurdish issue to destabilize Turkey. So, while Israel may favor stronger Kurdish autonomy as a counterweight to Ankara, and transforming that into a major proxy strategy would be far more difficult. Ankara knows how dangerous Kurdish separatism can be. It also knows how to apply pressure in northern Syria without necessarily triggering a wider regional confrontation. So what could actually trigger a crisis? This is where the situation becomes much more dangerous, because wars don't always begin because governments decide they want one. Sometimes they begin because red lines are not clearly understood. And there are several potential red lines worth watching. The first is the most obvious: Turkish military casualties from an Israeli strike. Israel can strike Syrian facilities, it can destroy equipment, But if an Israeli strike kills Turkish soldiers, the political calculation in Ankara changes dramatically. Erdogan could find himself under enormous domestic pressure to respond. The second trigger would be Turkey deploying advanced air defense systems at strategic Syrian bases such as T4, Palmyra, or Abu al-Daher. This could threaten Israel's freedom of action over Syria. For Israel, freedom of air operations isn't a minor tactical advantage. It is central to Israel's strategy to prevent threats from emerging before they become operational. And if Turkish air defense systems begin restricting that freedom, Israel would face a difficult choice. Do we accept a shrinking operational environment, or do we just destroy those systems? And let's say if Turkish personnel are operating those systems, you can immediately see how quickly this escalation ladder becomes. The third risk is the collapse of the emerging Israel-Syria framework. As long as some mechanism exists through which Israel can justify and contain limited military action, both sides have room to manage incidents. If that framework disappears, the risk of miscalculation increases substantially. And then there is Netanyahu. This dimension should not be ignored: Israeli domestic politics. Netanyahu faces elections in October, and Israeli security policy cannot be completely separate from Israeli politics. This doesn't mean that every Israeli strike is an electoral maneuver. That would be far too simplistic. Israel has genuine security concerns in Syria, but political incentives also matter. A leader facing an election after years of war has obvious reasons to project strength. And since the October 7, 2023 attacks, Israel's strategic doctrine has become dramatically more aggressive. The implicit message has increasingly been, Israel will not wait for threats to mature. It will act preemptively. It will strike further away. It will accept greater diplomatic costs in exchange for reducing perceived risks. That doctrine worked largely against Iran and its proxies. The question is whether it will work equally well when the emerging competitor is Turkey, because the risk-reward calculation is very different. So, is this a new Cold War? I think Cold War is slightly premature, but strategic rivalry is not. Israel and Turkey are not enemies in the conventional sense. Trade and diplomatic channels still matter, despite the rhetoric from Erdogan and Netanyahu. Both retain relationships with the US, and neither has much incentive to initiate direct conflict. But underneath that sits a widening structural disagreement of the future of the Middle East. And there's an important historical irony there. For much of the 20th century, Israel and Turkey actually had reasons to cooperate. Both were non-Arab regional powers. Both had complicated relationships with Arab nationalism. Both were aligned with the US. Today, however, their strategic trajectories are increasingly divergent. Turkey wants to become a central architect of the post-war regional order. Israel increasingly believes its security requires preventing regional actors from establishing military positions around it. Those two ideas can coexist until they can't. And that's why Syria matters. The most important thing about Syria today may not be Syria itself. It may be what Syria tells us about the regional system emerging after Iran's retreat. For decades, much of the Middle Eastern geopolitics revolved around a relatively simple axis: Iran and its proxies on one side, the Gulf states, the US and Israel on the other. That architecture is breaking apart. Saudi Arabia is pursuing greater strategic autonomy. Turkey is expanding its regional influence. Israel is acting increasingly independently. The US remains the dominant external power, but appears less capable, or perhaps even less willing, to dictate the behavior of its regional partners. And the result is a much more multipolar Middle East. And that may actually be harder to manage, because instead of one dominant confrontation, you begin getting multiple overlapping competitions. Israel versus Iran, Israel versus Turkey, Turkey versus the Kurds, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan competing and cooperating simultaneously, and the Gulf states and Israel balancing between the US, China, and regional powers, and Syria sits directly in the middle of many of these fault lines. So, what is the bigger question? This brings us back to what we started with. After Iran, is Israel creating its great next regional rival with Turkey? I wouldn't put it that strongly yet. Turkey isn't replacing Iran as Israel's principal enemy, and neither Ankara nor Jerusalem appears to want direct confrontation. But something important is changing. Israel spent years dismantling the military architecture Iran had built around it. In doing so, it helped create a regional vacuum, and vacuums create and attract power. Turkey is one of the few states with the geography, the military, the capability, the economic weight, and the political ambition to fill that vacuum. The irony is that Israel may eventually discover that removing one strategic threat doesn't necessarily produce security. Sometimes it simply changes the identity of the competitor. And unlike Iran, Turkey is a powerful NATO member with deep economic and military relationships and enormous geopolitical leverage. This makes a fundamentally different challenge. So I wouldn't watch for an Israel-Turkey war. I'd watch something subtler. Watch for Syrian air bases, watch Turkish air defense deployments, watch for Israeli strikes, and watch what happens to the Kurds. And above all, watch whether Turkey's presence in Syria becomes temporary or permanent. Because if Turkey becomes structurally embedded in Syria, and Israel continues to insist on unrestricted freedom of military action there, eventually those two strategic realities will collide. The Middle East may therefore be entering a strange new chapter. Multipolar region. Iran remains a major threat, but the regional system that emerges from its weakening may prove considerably more complicated than the one Israel spent decades trying to dismantle. And Syria may once more again be where we see that new order being born. After